The sun was climbing high over the small town of Parral, casting long shadows across the dusty cobblestone plaza. It was market day, and the square buzzed with life like a beehive stirred by a curious hand. Vendors called out their prices in sing-song voices. Children darted between the stalls chasing stray chickens, and the air filled with the rich smells of fresh tortillas, roasted corn, and strong coffee. In the middle of all this chaos, an old man named Don Aurelio made his way slowly through the crowd. His back was bent from decades of working the hard, desert soil, and his weathered hands told the story of a lifetime spent fighting to survive. He wore simple clothes, clean but patched in several places, and carried a small leather pouch that contained every peso he had managed to save over the past month. Don Aurelio was 73 years old, though he looked older. The harsh Mexican, sun and years of back-breaking labor had carved deep lines into his face, but his eyes still held a quiet dignity, the kind that comes from living an honest life, even when that life has been filled with struggle. He approached one of the merchant stalls with careful steps, his joints creaking like old wooden doors. The stall belonged to a man who sold flour, beans, and other basic foods that families needed to survive. Don Aurelio had been coming to this same stall for years, always polite, always paying what he could, never causing trouble for anyone. Merchant behind the counter was a different story entirely. His name was Sebastian Morales, and he was the kind of man who had learned early in life that money could buy him power over others. He was well fed while his customers often went hungry. His clothes were fine while theirs were worn thin, and he had discovered that the poorer someone was, the easier it became to take advantage of them. Morales watched Don Aurelio approach with cold, calculating eyes. He had been raising his prices steadily over the past few months, especially for customers like the old farmer who had no choice but to buy from him. Other merchants in town were afraid to compete with Morales because he had friends in high places, corrupt officials who would make life difficult for anyone who got in his way. "Buenos dias, Señor Morales," Don Aurelio said quietly, removing his worn hat as a sign of respect. His voice carried the soft politeness of a man who had learned to be careful around those with power. Morales barely looked up from counting his money. "What do you want, old man? Make it quick, I have real customers to serve." Don Aurelio felt the sting of the insult but said nothing. He needed flour to make bread for his family. His daughter-in-law had just given birth to her third child, and there were many mouths to feed with very little money coming in. "I need 5 pounds of flour, please," he said, placing his small pouch of coins on the wooden counter with trembling fingers. Morales glanced at the pouch and sneered. "5 pounds? That'll be 12 pesos. The old man's eyes widened in shock. Just last month, 5 pounds of flour had cost him 8 pesos. The month before that, it had been 6. 12 pesos? Senor, I think there must be some mistake. Last time was last time, Morales cut him off harshly. Prices have gone up. If you don't like it, go buy somewhere else. But they both knew there was nowhere else to go. The other merchants in town either charged similar prices or had been driven out of business by men like Morales. Don Aurelio opened his pouch and counted his coins slowly, his arthritic fingers struggling with the small pieces of metal. I only have 9 pesos, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Please, senor. My family needs this flour. My grandson, he is just a baby. What Don Aurelio didn't know was that someone was watching this entire exchange with growing interest. At a small table outside a nearby cantina, a stocky man with a thick black mustache sat quietly sipping his morning coffee. He wore simple clothes like any working man and a wide-brimmed hat that cast shadows across his face. To most people walking by, he looked like just another traveler passing through town. But this was no ordinary traveler. This was Francisco Pancho Villa, one of the most famous and feared revolutionary leaders in all of Mexico. Villa had come to Parral seeking a few quiet hours away from the constant battles and political meetings that filled his days. He had grown up not far from here, and sometimes he needed to remember what he was fighting for. He came to places like this market to see the faces of ordinary people, to remind himself that his war was about more than politics and power. As he watched the scene unfolding at Morales's stall, Villa's dark eyes began to narrow. He had seen this kind of thing too many times, the strong preying on the weak, the rich taking advantage of the poor. It was exactly the kind of injustice that had driven him to take up arms in the first place. Villa took another slow sip of his coffee, but his attention was completely focused on the old man and the merchant. He could see the desperation in Don Aurelio's face, the way his shoulders sagged with defeat. He could hear the arrogance in Morales's voice, the casual cruelty of someone who had never known real hardship. The revolutionary leader had learned, long ago, to read people quickly and accurately. It was a skill that had kept him alive through countless battles and betrayals, and what he was reading now made his blood begin to boil. Around the plaza, other customers and vendors were starting to notice the confrontation. Some watched with sympathy for the old man, but most looked away quickly. They knew better than to get involved in Morales' business. The merchant had a reputation for remembering people who crossed him, and he had ways of making their lives difficult. Don Aurelio continued to plead quietly for fairness, his voice growing more desperate with each word. "Please, Señor Morales, I am a good customer. I always pay what I owe. Can you not make an exception this one time?" But Morales was enjoying his power too much to show mercy. He had discovered that humiliating people like Don Aurelio made him feel important, made him feel like he was somebody special. The fact that there was an audience made it even better. "I told you the price, old fool," he said loudly, making sure everyone nearby could hear. "If you can't afford it, then maybe you should have worked harder when you were younger instead of being lazy." The insult hit Don Aurelio like a physical blow. He had worked hard every single day of his adult life. His hands were proof of that, scarred and calloused from decades of honest labor. But he was too proud to defend himself with angry words, and too afraid of making his situation worse. Villa's hand tightened around his coffee cup as he watched the old man's humiliation. The revolutionary had been born into poverty himself, had watched his own family suffer at the hands of men like Morales. He knew what it felt like to be powerless, to have to swallow your pride just to survive another day. But Pancho Villa was no longer powerless, and he had never learned to walk away from a fight, especially when that fight was against injustice. The morning sun continued to climb higher, and the market day bustle went on around them. But in that small corner of the plaza, tensions were building toward something that would be remembered and talked about for years to come. Don Aurelio stood there with his 9 pesos, knowing it wasn't enough, knowing he would have to return home empty-handed to his hungry family. Morales stood behind his counter with his cruel smile, enjoying every moment of the old man's suffering. And at his table outside the cantina, Pancho Villa finished the last of his coffee and slowly, deliberately, began to stand up. The tension in the air grew thicker than the dust swirling around the market plaza. Don Aurelio stood frozen at the counter, his 9 pesos clutched in his weathered hand, while Sebastian Morales waited with the patience of a cat watching a cornered mouse. "Well?" Morales demanded, his voice cutting through the morning bustle like a sharp knife. "Are you going to pay the 12 pesos or not? I don't have all day to waste on beggars." The word beggar hit the old man harder than any physical blow could have. Don Aurelio had never begged for anything in his entire life. Even in his poorest moments, he had always found a way to earn what his family needed through honest work. His pride, worn thin by years of struggle, finally began to crack. "I am not a beggar, senor," he said quietly, but with a strength that surprised even himself. "I am a working man who has paid you fairly for years. All I am asking is that you remember that, and perhaps show a little kindness." Morales' face darkened like a storm cloud. He was not used to being challenged, especially not by someone as powerless as this old farmer. In his mind, people like Don Aurelio existed only to make him richer, and they should be grateful for whatever scraps he chose to throw them. "Kindness?" Morales laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You want kindness? Here's some kindness for you. I'm not calling the police to have you arrested for disturbing my business. Now take your 9 pesos and get out of my sight. Before I change my mind." Around them, the crowd began to gather. Word was spreading through the market that something was happening at Morales's stall, and people started to slow their shopping to watch. Some looked sympathetic to the old man's situation, but most kept their distance. They knew that Morales had friends in powerful places, and crossing him could mean trouble for their own families. Don Aurelio looked down at the coins in his palm, then back up at the merchant's cold eyes. He thought about his daughter-in-law, still weak from childbirth, and the new baby who needed proper nutrition. He thought about his son, working from sunrise to sunset but never earning quite enough to feed everyone. He thought about his other grandchildren, who had gone to bed hungry more nights than any child should. "Please," he said one more time, his voice barely above a whisper. "My family needs this flour. I will bring you the other 3 pesos next week, I promise you that. I have never broken my word to you or anyone else." That was when Sebastian Morales made the decision that would change everything. He had been enjoying the old man's humiliation, but now he wanted to make an example that everyone in the market would remember. He wanted to show them all what happened to people who dared to argue with him. "Your promises are worthless, old fool," he snarled, leaning forward across the counter. "Just like you are. You're a useless, broken-down piece of garbage that should have died years ago instead of wasting everyone's time." The cruel words echoed across the plaza, and several people gasped at their harshness. Even by Morales's standards, this was exceptionally cruel. But the merchant wasn't finished yet. Before Don Aurelio could react, Morales reached across the counter and shoved the old man hard in the chest. Don Aurelio, already unsteady on his feet, stumbled backward and lost his balance completely. His arms windmilled desperately as he tried to stay upright, but his aged body couldn't recover in time. The old man crashed to the cobblestones with a sickening thud that made everyone within earshot wince. His coins scattered across the ground, ringing like small bells as they rolled in different directions. Don Aurelio lay there for a moment, stunned and trying to catch his breath, his ribs aching from where they had struck the hard stones. The crowd pressed closer now, shocked by what they had just witnessed. A few people started to move forward to help the fallen elder, but Morales's voice stopped them cold. "Stay back," he shouted, his face red with anger and something that looked almost like madness. This old dog got exactly what he deserved. Don Aurelio struggled to push himself up, his movements slow and painful. His knees had been scraped raw by the fall, and his back screamed in protest as he tried to rise. But before he could get to his feet, Morales came around the counter with fire in his eyes. "You think you can make demands of me?" the merchant yelled, standing over the fallen man like a vulture over roadkill. "You think your pathetic begging means anything to me?" What happened next would be burned into the memories of everyone who witnessed it. Morales drew back his foot and kicked Don Aurelio viciously in the ribs, the impact making a hollow sound that carried across the suddenly silent plaza. The old man cried out in pain and curled up on his side, trying to protect himself from further attack. But Morales wasn't finished. He grabbed a wooden measuring stick from his stall, a thick piece of oak that he used to measure fabric and rope. He raised it above his head like a club, his face twisted with rage and something darker. "This is what happens to people who don't know their place," he screamed, bringing the stick down hard across Don Aurelio's back. The old man's agonized cry pierced the morning air. Several women in the crowd covered their mouths in horror while children began to cry at the terrible sounds. But still, no one moved to help. They were all too afraid of what Morales might do to them. Again and again, the merchant brought the stick down on the defenseless elder, across his shoulders, his back, his arms, as he tried desperately to shield his head. Each blow drew another cry of pain from Don Aurelio, each impact making the watching crowd flinch as if they themselves were being beaten. Blood began to trickle from the old man's nose where his face had struck the cobblestones. His lip was split, and dark bruises were already forming on his exposed skin. He had stopped trying to get up and simply lay there, covering his head with his arms and waiting for the beating to end. "Please," he whispered between gasps of pain. "Please, no more." But his pleading only seemed to fuel Morales's fury. The merchant was lost in his rage now, enjoying the absolute power he held over this helpless human being. He raised the stick, again, aiming for the old man's head this time. That's when he noticed that the crowd had gone completely silent. Not the normal quiet of people watching something terrible, but the kind of dead silence that comes when everyone suddenly realizes that danger is approaching. Morales paused with the stick still raised above his head and looked around. What he saw made his blood run cold. The crowd wasn't looking at him anymore. They were all staring at something behind him, and the expressions on their faces ranged from shock to fear to something that looked almost like hope. He turned slowly, the wooden stick still clutched in his sweating hands, and found himself face to face with a stocky man in simple clothes and a wide-brimmed hat. The man's dark eyes were fixed on Morales with an intensity that made the merchant take an involuntary step backward. From somewhere in the crowd, a voice whispered a name that made everyone's heart skip a beat. Pancho Villa, the legendary revolutionary, stood perfectly still, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. But everyone who looked at him could sense the terrible violence that was building inside him like steam in a boiler. His eyes moved from Morales to the bleeding old man on the ground, then back to the merchant's terrified face. When Villa finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried clearly across the silent plaza. "Only a coward," he said slowly, "beats an old man who cannot defend himself." Sebastian Morales found himself staring into the eyes of one of the most dangerous men in Mexico, with a bloodied elder at his feet and a crowd of witnesses surrounding them. The wooden stick suddenly felt very heavy in his trembling hands. The moment of reckoning had arrived. The silence that fell over the market plaza was unlike anything the people of Parral had ever experienced. It was as if the entire world had suddenly stopped breathing. Even the chickens seemed to sense that something momentous was happening and fell quiet in their cages. Sebastian Morales stood frozen with the wooden measuring stick still clutched in his hands, staring at the man who had appeared as if from nowhere. At first, the merchant's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. This couldn't be the famous Pancho Villa. This was just some ordinary-looking fellow in working clothes who had decided to stick his nose where it didn't belong. But as the whispered name spread through the crowd like wildfire, more and more people began to recognize the legendary figure. Old women crossed themselves and muttered prayers under their breath. Young men straightened their shoulders with sudden pride, while others took nervous steps backward, remembering the stories they had heard about Villa's explosive temper. Villa himself remained perfectly calm, but those who knew him understood that this was often when he was most dangerous. His dark eyes never left Morales's face as he took a slow, deliberate step forward. Then another. Each footstep on the cobblestone seemed to echo like thunder in the unnatural quiet. "Did you hear what I said?" Villa asked, his voice still soft, but carrying an edge that made several people in the crowd shiver despite the warm morning sun. "I said only a coward beats an old man who cannot fight back." Morales's brain finally began to work again, though not very well. Fear and confusion battled with his natural arrogance and the desperate need to maintain his reputation in front of all these people. He had built his power in this town on the belief that he was untouchable, that his connections would protect him from any consequences. This is none of your business, stranger," Morales stammered, trying to inject some authority into his voice. "This old fool was disturbing my customers and refusing to pay what he owes. I was just teaching him some manners." Villa glanced down at Don Aurelio, who was still curled up on the ground, blood seeping from his nose and mouth onto the dusty stones. The old man's breathing was labored, and Villa could see the pain etched into every line of his weathered face. When the revolutionary looked back up at Morales, something had changed in his expression. "Teaching him manners?" Villa repeated, and though his voice remained quiet, there was now a quality to it that made the hair on people's necks stand up. "With a stick? Against a man who could be your grandfather?" More whispers rippled through the crowd as people began pointing Villa out to their neighbors. "That's really him," someone said. "That's Pancho Villa." Children were lifted onto their fathers' shoulders to get a better look at the famous rebel leader, while their mothers clutched their shawls tighter around their shoulders. Villa was used to being recognized, but right now his attention was completely focused on the scene before him. He had witnessed injustice many times in his life. It was one of the driving forces behind his revolution. But there was something about seeing an elderly man beaten in public, with a crowd too frightened to help, that struck him at his very Cor Morales was beginning to realize that he was in serious trouble, but his pride wouldn't let him back down completely. He had spent too many years building his reputation as someone who couldn't be challenged. If he showed weakness now, in front of all these people, his authority in the town would crumble. "I don't care who you think you are," he said, raising the wooden stick slightly. "This is my business, and this old man got what was coming to him. If you don't like it, you can move along before you find yourself in the same condition." The crowd gasped at Morales' words. Even those who didn't know much about Pancho Villa understood that threatening him was probably the worst decision the merchant could have made. Several people began backing away, sensing that violence was about to explode across the plaza like a summer storm. Villa's reaction was not what anyone expected. Instead of flying into a rage, he smiled. But it was not a pleasant smile. It was the kind of smile a wolf might wear when it spotted a wounded deer. "You're threatening me?" Villa asked, and now there was something almost playful in his voice, which somehow made it even more terrifying. "You think you can beat me with that little stick the same way you beat that helpless old man?" He took another step forward, close enough now that Morales could smell the coffee on his breath and see the scars that marked Villa's hands and face, evidence of countless battles fought and won. "Let me tell you something, friend," Villa continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I've been shot at by federal armies. I've fought battles against thousands of men. I've stared death in the face more times than you've probably counted your money. And you think you can frighten me with a piece of wood?" Morales' hands were shaking now, though he tried to hide it by gripping the measuring stick tighter. Sweat was beginning to bead on his forehead despite the cool morning air. He looked around desperately, hoping to see some of his usual supporters in the crowd, but found only faces watching him with a mixture of fear and anticipation. "Besides," Villa added, his smile growing wider and more dangerous, "I heard what you called him. Worthless old dog, wasn't it? Should have died years ago? Those are interesting words coming from a man who's never done an honest day's work in his life." The accuracy of Villa's observations sent murmurs through the crowd. Everyone in Parral knew that Morales had inherited his business from his father and had spent his life taking advantage of people who had no other choices. He had never worked in the fields under the burning sun or struggled to feed a family on a few pesos a week. Don Aurelio, still lying on the ground, had managed to turn his head enough to see what was happening. Despite his pain, his eyes widened with amazement as he realized who had come to his defense. He tried to speak, to warn this famous man that Morales had powerful friends, but his voice came out as barely a croak. Villa heard the sound and knelt down beside the injured elder, careful not to take his eyes off Morales for more than a second. "Easy, old father," he said gently, using a term of respect that made several people in the crowd nod approvingly. "Don't try to talk right now. Just rest." When Villa stood back up, the gentleness was gone from his face, replaced by something cold and hard as winter steel. "You know what I think?" he said to Morales. "I think you're a bully who's gotten too comfortable picking on people who can't fight back. I think you've forgotten what it feels like to be afraid." Morales tried one last desperate bluff. "You can't touch me," he said, though his voice cracked on the words. "I have friends in the government, important people who will make you pay if you lay a hand on me." Villa laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass. "Government friends? The same government I've been fighting for the past 10 years? The same corrupt officials who let men like you steal from the poor while they get rich?" He shook his head. "I don't think your friends are going to help you today." The revolutionary leader began rolling up his sleeves with deliberate care, like a man preparing for serious work. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that they were about to witness something that would be talked about for generations. "You want to show everyone how strong you are?" Villa asked, flexing his scarred hands. "You want to prove that you're a tough man who deserves respect? Here's your chance. Face someone who can fight back." Morales looked around desperately one more time, hoping against hope that someone would intervene, that some miracle would save him from the situation he had created. But he saw only faces hungry for justice, people who had watched him abuse his power for years and were finally going to see him get what he deserved. The merchant raised his wooden stick with trembling hands, knowing that he had pushed things too far to back down now. But deep in his heart, he already knew how this was going to end. Pancho Villa had never been known for showing mercy to bullies and cowards, and Sebastian Morales was about to learn why. The moment stretched out like a guitar string pulled tight, ready to snap at any second. Sebastian Morales stood there with his wooden measuring stick raised above his head, his hands shaking so badly that the stick wobbled in the air. Across from him, Pancho Villa waited with the patience of a mountain cat watching its prey, his dark eyes never blinking. The crowd held its collective breath. Children peered out from behind their mothers' skirts, while grown men leaned forward, not wanting to miss a single second of what was about to unfold. This was the kind of moment that would be remembered and retold for decades to come. Morales made the first move, swinging the wooden stick down toward Villa's head with all the strength his fear-weakened arms could manage. It was a clumsy, desperate attack, the swing of a man who had never been in a real fight in his life, who had only ever used violence against those too weak to defend themselves. Villa moved like lightning. His left hand shot up and caught Morales' wrist in midair, stopping the stick just inches from his face. The merchant's eyes went wide with shock and terror as he realized that his most powerful blow had been stopped as easily as swatting a fly. "My turn," Villa said quietly. What happened next was swift, brutal, and absolutely devastating. Villa's right fist, hardened by years of fighting and farm work, connected with Morales' jaw with a sound like a hammer hitting wood. The merchant's head snapped back. His eyes rolled up and he staggered sideways like a drunk man trying to dance. The wooden measuring stick fell from his nerveless fingers and clattered across the cobblestones. Blood began to flow from Morales' split lip, and he made a gurgling sound as he tried to stay on his feet. But Villa was just getting started. Before Morales could recover his balance, Villa grabbed him by the front of his fine shirt and hauled him upright. The fabric tore slightly under the strain, and the merchant found himself staring into Villa's eyes from just inches away. "You like hitting people who can't defend themselves?" Villa asked, his voice calm and conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. "Let's see how you like it when the tables are turned." Villa's second punch caught Morales in the stomach, driving all the air from his lungs in a whooshing gasp. The merchant doubled over, clutching his belly, but Villa's grip on his shirt kept him from falling. The revolutionary leader was methodical now, each blow carefully placed to cause maximum pain without causing permanent damage. At least not yet. A third punch to the ribs made Morales cry out in agony. A fourth to the same spot made him whimper, like a beaten dog. The crowd watched in fascination as their town's most feared bully was reduced to a sobbing, bloodied mess in the span of mere minutes. "Please," Morales gasped between punches. "Please stop. I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean what?" Villa interrupted, landing another blow to the merchant's midsection. "You didn't mean to beat an innocent old man? You didn't mean to humiliate him in front of half the town? Or you didn't mean to get caught?" Villa released his grip on Morales' shirt, and the merchant collapsed to his knees on the same cobblestones where Don Aurelio had been bleeding just minutes before. The irony was not lost on the watching crowd, several of whom nodded grimly at the poetic justice of the moment. But Villa wasn't finished. He walked slowly around the kneeling merchant like a general inspecting a defeated enemy. Morales tried to crawl away, but Villa's boot came down gently but firmly on his back, pressing him flat against the stones. "Where do you think you're going?" Villa asked. "We're not done here yet. You gave that old man quite a beating. I think it's only fair that you get to experience the same treatment." The crowd murmured its approval. These were people who had suffered under Morales' greed and cruelty for years, who had watched him grow fat and rich while their own families went hungry. Seeing him brought low like this felt like justice finally being served. Villa picked up the wooden measuring stick that Morales had dropped. He tested its weight in his hands, swinging it through the air with practiced ease. The stick made a whistling sound as it cut through the morning air, and Morales whimpered at the sound. "This is what you used on Don Aurelio, isn't it?" Villa asked, examining the piece of wood as if seeing it for the first time. "It's a good solid stick," Oak, I think. Must hurt quite a bit when it hits someone. No, please, Morales begged, his voice breaking like a child's. I'm sorry, I was wrong. I'll never do it again, I swear. Villa paused and looked down at the cowering merchant. You'll never do it again? That's interesting. Does that mean you admit that what you did was wrong? Yes, Morales sobbed. Yes, it was wrong. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Sorry to who? Villa demanded. Sorry to me? I'm not the one you beat half to death. Villa gestured toward Don Aurelio, who was still lying nearby. Though some kind women from the crowd had come forward to help him sit up and clean the blood from his face. The old man watched the proceedings with amazement, still hardly able to believe that someone had finally stood up for him. Crawl over there, Villa commanded, pointing the stick at Don Aurelio. Crawl on your hands and knees like the dog you are and apologize to that man properly. Morales hesitated for just a moment, and Villa raised the stick meaningfully. That was all the encouragement the merchant needed. He began crawling across the cobblestones, his fine clothes tearing on the rough stone, his knees and palms getting scraped raw just as Don Aurelio's had been. When he reached the old man, Morales collapsed completely, pressing his forehead to the ground at Don Aurelio's feet. Forgive me, old father, he whispered, using the same respectful term Villa had used. I was wrong, I was cruel, please forgive me. Don Aurelio looked down at his tormentor with a mixture of satisfaction and pity. Despite everything that had happened, the old man's inherent kindness made it hard for him to take pleasure in another's suffering, even someone who had caused him so much pain. I forgive you, Don Aurelio said quietly, but you must promise never to treat anyone else this way. Villa nodded approvingly at the old man's grace, but his expression remained hard when he looked back at Morales. That's very generous of him, the revolutionary said. Much more generous than you deserve. But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. The stick came down across Morales's back with a sharp crack that echoed across the plaza. The merchant screamed and tried to curl up into a ball, but Villa was relentless. Again and again the oak stick fell, each blow precise and controlled but undeniably painful. This is for every time you cheated a poor family, Villa said, landing another blow. This is for every time you took advantage of someone's desperation. This is for every cruel word you spoke to people who deserved better. The beating continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Villa was careful not to strike Morales's head or anywhere that might cause permanent injury, but he made sure the merchant felt every ounce of pain he had inflicted on others over the years. Finally, when Morales was nothing more than a broken, sobbing heap on the cobblestones, Villa threw the stick aside and stepped back. The merchant lay motionless except for the shaking of his shoulders as he wept. Get up, Villa commanded. Morales tried to rise, but his legs wouldn't support him. Villa waited patiently while the merchant struggled to his feet, swaying like a tree in a strong wind. When Morales finally managed to stand, his face was a mess of blood, tears, and dirt. Look at me, Villa said. Morales raised his eyes reluctantly, afraid of what he might see in the revolutionary's face. If I ever hear that you've mistreated another person in this town, Villa said slowly, making sure every word was understood, if I ever learn that you've gone back to your old ways, I will return, and next time, I won't be so gentle. Do you understand me? Yes, Morales whispered. Yes, I understand. Good. Villa turned away from the defeated merchant and walked back to Don Aurelio, who was now sitting upright with the help of some women from the crowd. The revolutionary knelt down and gently pressed a leather pouch into the old man's hands. This should be enough to buy flour for your family for the next month, Villa said quietly, and medicine for your injuries. Don Aurelio tried to refuse the money, but Villa's expression brooked no argument. The old man clutched the pouch to his chest, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. The legend of Pancho Villa's justice had just grown by another chapter, and everyone who witnessed it would remember this day for the rest of their lives. The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, casting shorter shadows across the plaza, but the crowd showed no signs of dispersing. Word had spread throughout Parral like wildfire and people were still arriving to see the aftermath of what had just occurred. Sebastian Morales sat slumped against a wall, holding a cloth to his bleeding face while Don Aurelio was being tended to by several local women who had brought water and clean rags to clean his wounds. Pancho Villa stood in the center of it, all his dark eyes surveying the faces surrounding him. He could see the mixture of emotions there: satisfaction, relief, excitement, and in some cases fear. These people had lived under the thumb of men like Morales for so long that they hardly knew how to react to seeing justice served so swiftly and completely. Villa understood that this was more than just a fight between two men. This was a moment that could change how people thought about power and justice in their community. He had learned long ago that action spoke louder than any speech he could give, but sometimes words were needed to make sure the lesson was understood clearly. He walked slowly to the center of the plaza, his boots clicking on the cobblestones with each measured step. The crowd quieted immediately, sensing that their famous visitor had something important to say. Even the vendors stopped their calling and the children ceased their playing to listen. Villa removed his wide-brimmed hat and held it respectfully in his hands as he began to speak. His voice carried clearly across the plaza, reaching every ear without him having to shout. "My friends," he began, using the familiar term that immediately made his audience feel connected to him. "What you witnessed here today was not about one man's anger or another man's punishment. It was about something much more important than that." He gestured toward Don Aurelio, who was now sitting upright and looking much better thanks to the care he was receiving from his neighbors. This good man, this honest worker who has spent his life serving his family and community, was beaten not because he had done anything wrong, but because someone with power thought he could get away with it, because someone believed that having money and connections meant he could treat other human beings like animals. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Everyone there had either experienced similar treatment themselves or had watched. It happened to someone they cared about. Villa's voice grew stronger, more passionate. "But I am here to tell you that this is not the way things have to be. In Mexico, we have a saying, El pueblo unido jamás será vencido. The people united will never be defeated. When we stand together, when we protect each other, when we refuse to let bullies and cowards rule over us, we become stronger than any army, more powerful than any government." He turned slowly, making eye contact with as many people as possible, ensuring that his words reached not just their ears but their hearts. "Look around you," he continued. "Look at your neighbors, your friends, your family members. These are good people, honest people, hard-working people who deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. You should not have to beg for fair treatment. You should not have to accept abuse because you are afraid of the consequences of standing up for yourselves." An elderly woman near the front of the crowd called out, "But what can we do, General? We are not fighters like you. We have no weapons, no power." Villa smiled at her, the same gentle smile he had shown to Don Aurelio. "Señora, you have more power than you know. Your power lies in your unity, in your refusal to accept injustice as normal. When merchants like Morales there," he pointed, at the still cowering man, "try to cheat you, you can choose to take your business elsewhere. When corrupt officials try to oppress you, you can stand together and demand better treatment." He walked over to where several young men were standing together, watching him with obvious admiration. "And you, the strong young men of this community, you have a responsibility to protect those who cannot protect themselves. When you see an elder being mistreated, when you witness a child being bullied, when you watch injustice happening in front of your eyes, you must not simply stand by and do nothing." One of the young men stepped forward, his chest puffed out with newfound courage. "But General Villa, what if we get in trouble with the authorities? What if they arrest us or hurt our families?" Villa's expression grew serious. "There is always risk in doing what is right, my young friend, but there is a greater risk in doing nothing. When good people stay silent in the face of evil, evil grows stronger. When honest men refuse to stand up to corruption, corruption spreads like a disease." He gestured broadly, encompassing the entire crowd. "But when people like you, ordinary citizens with extraordinary courage, decide that enough is enough, mountains can be moved. I have seen it happen. I have been part of it happening." Villa walked back to the center of the plaza and raised his voice so that even those at the back could hear clearly. Let what happened here today be a message that spreads throughout this region, he declared. Let it be known that in every town, in every village, in every community, there are people who will not tolerate the abuse of the innocent. Let the bullies and the corrupt officials and the greedy merchants know that their actions have consequences. He pointed directly at Morales, who flinched under his gaze. This man learned today that power without honor is worthless, that money without decency means nothing, that fear only works until someone refuses to be afraid. Villa turned back to the crowd. I will not always be here to fight your battles for you. My war takes me to many places, against many enemies, but each of you has the power to be a Pancho Villa in your own community, in your own way. You have the power to stand up for what is right, to protect those who need protection, to ensure that justice is not just a word, but a reality. A cheer went up from the crowd, starting with the young men, but quickly spreading to include almost everyone present. Villa held up his hand for quiet, and the plaza fell silent again. I want to tell you something about Don Aurelio, Villa said, walking over to where the old man was sitting. This man, who was beaten and humiliated today, showed more dignity and grace in his suffering than his attacker showed in his moment of power. When I asked Morales to apologize, Don Aurelio forgave him immediately. That, my friends, is true strength. That is the kind of character that makes a person truly wealthy, no matter how few pesos they have in their pocket. Don Aurelio tried to wave away the praise, embarrassed by the attention, but Villa gently placed a hand on his shoulder. Stand up, old father, Villa said softly. Let everyone see the man they should aspire to be like. With help from Villa and some of the women, nearby Don Aurelio struggled to his feet. Despite his injuries, despite his torn and bloodied clothes, there was something noble about the way he stood there in front of his community. The crowd erupted in applause, a sound that echoed off the buildings surrounding the plaza. Don Aurelio's eyes filled with tears, not of pain this time, but of joy and pride. Never in his 73 years had he been the center of such positive attention, such respect and admiration. Villa let the applause continue for several minutes before raising his hand for quiet again. Remember this moment, he said to the crowd. Remember that heroes come in all shapes and sizes from all walks of life. Don Aurelio is a hero not because he won a fight, but because he lived his life with honor and dignity, even when others tried to take that away from him. The revolutionary leader walked back to where Morales was still sitting against the wall, looking like a man who had aged 10 years in the span of an hour. Villa crouched down so they were at eye level. And you, he said quietly, but loud enough for nearby people to hear. You have been given a gift today, the gift of a second chance. Use it wisely, treat people fairly, show respect to your elders. Remember that every person who enters your store is a human being deserving of dignity. Morales nodded frantically, still too frightened and beaten to speak coherently. Villa stood up and addressed the crowd one final time. I must leave you now. My men are waiting for me, and there are other battles to fight. But I want you to remember what happened here today. I want you to tell your children and your grandchildren about it, and most importantly, I want you to live it. He put his hat back on his head and began walking toward the edge of the plaza, but then he stopped and turned back. Oh, and one more thing, he said with a slight smile. If anyone tries to overcharge Don Aurelio for flour ever again, they will answer to me personally. The crowd laughed and cheered as Villa disappeared into the narrow streets of Parral, but the effects of his visit would last much longer than his physical presence. Over the following weeks and months, word of what had happened in the plaza spread throughout Chihuahua and beyond. Merchants in dozens of towns suddenly found themselves treating their customers with unprecedented fairness and respect. Local bullies discovered that the communities they had once terrorized were no longer willing to tolerate their behavior. Don Aurelio lived for 8 more years after that day, and he never had to worry about buying food for his family again. The people of Parral made sure of that, bringing him gifts and showing him the respect that Villa had said he deserved. He became something of a local celebrity, sought out by visitors who wanted to hear the story of Pancho Villa's justice.